The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, what lessons have Canada and the rest of the world learned from the 2008 financial crisis? Then, Steve Paikin and guests on whether our nation will be able to fulfill its natural resource sector ambitions. That's ahead on The Agenda. Housing affordability and lagging productivity in Canada, the economic rise of China and the global south, the surge of the tech economy in the U.S. Our guest tonight will argue these can be traced back to the great financial crisis of 2008, a topic we covered at the time and throughout our 19 seasons on The Agenda. There's an argument to be made that the world is still living in the shadow of that bank-led global financial meltdown. To explore this further, we are joined by, in Vancouver, British Columbia, Jim Stanford, economist and director of the Centre for Future Work. In the nation's capital, Angela McEwen, senior economist with the Canadian Union of Public Employees. And here in our studio, Randall Germain, professor of political science at Carleton University. Welcome to those who are joining online, and thank you, Randall, for joining us in studio. Jim, I'm actually going to come to you first. I want you to take us back to the early 2007s, around the time where the U.S. banks started announcing losses related to the subprime market, mortgage market. Tell us, what was the Canadian economy performing? What was happening here?
Well, we weren't doing too badly. We had our stresses and strains in Canada at that time. One of the important things that was happening was our Canadian dollar was really strong at that point in time, too strong, trading over par with the U.S. dollar for a while. And that was related to the oil boom that was happening out in Alberta, particularly the big expansion of bitumen projects and oil exports. So that high dollar was causing some problems in our manufacturing sector even before the global financial crisis hit. But, we weren't in a recession. We were growing. We were trying to, grapple with some of those challenges. Our financial system in Canada was pretty strong. The banks, of course, are very powerful, very concentrated in Canada. And, that has its negative aspects. But the positive aspect is that the banks were very strong. So until, all this mess erupted south of the border, really, we weren't in bad shape in Canada.
All right, Angela, I'll get you to add on that as well. What was that picture like for Canada in the early 2007s?
Sure. Well, I was actually still doing my master's in economics at that point in time. And so it was a really interesting time to be studying economics and watching what was happening in the United States and thinking about what the impact would be in Canada, because we had some of the same trends with like super low interest rates and increasing financialization in the housing market that were driving up housing prices. But we had the more stable banking system. So there was a lot of nervousness and anxiety, I think, about the impact of the global recession and how that would impact Canada. That was kind of more the concern that we were seeing in Canada, that this was going to impact the world, and then how would that affect our ability to trade and our ability to kind of make money off of the things that we sell to the rest of the world if they're all going through this crisis.
All right. Randall, speaking of trends, what trends were driving the global economy at that time?
I mean, I think the main trend from the early 1990s right through to September 2008 was the liberalization of financial markets and of economies, the opening up of economies. The word is globalization. It really was a powerful pressure that was reverberating around the world. And alongside that pressure, there was, it was a kind of a new era. Those of us who were studying that back at the time, it was a new era of international cooperation and collaboration. If you were looking at the way in which financial systems were evolving, there was an increasing amount of cooperation, a lot of attention being paid to addressing the systemic issues that did arise in the late 1990s with a kind of a currency crisis in parts of Asia. But the big story really was globalization and economic integration, and along with that, really the first powerful emergence of non-OECD markets. And so China was really beginning. India, Brazil. That's the term BRICS, which became very popular after 2000. It was coined by Goldman Sachs in 2004. This was the overriding pressure. But at the same time, I think this became really obvious after the financial crisis, was a kind of a decentering of the American economy. It had begun. So you saw this globalization, and it was at the point in time when the United States became less central to the way that the global economy was functioning. Not for Canada, we're still tied in lockstep with the United States. It's a problem. It's an issue that we've had to deal with. But globally, it really wasn't opening up.
Okay. All right. We know that Canada weathered the crisis. You used to look at it on this side, much better than advanced economies. I want to show an interview clip with former Prime Minister Paul Martin in 2011 on this program, where he explained some of the reasons why. Have a look.
Well, we in Canada actually have handled that very, very well. We did it when we basically improved bank regulation at a time when other countries were weakening theirs, when New York and London were competing and we didn't. We did it when we did not allow the banks to merge, and our banks are very well managed. So that part of the crises we've taken care of. The Bank of Canada have shown exactly the same thing. Without a doubt, the worst financial crises are those that stem from bank crises because it's a failure of confidence and trust, and the economy depends on confidence.
Why did Canadian banks and regulators have such a different view of risk and governance compared to those institutions in the U.S. and Europe?
Well, some of it comes from Canadian nationalism, to tell you the truth. We've had fairly strong regulations limiting the role of foreign banks in Canada's economy, and in a way protecting the big Canadian banks that we have. And again, as I mentioned, there's a plus side and a negative side to this. The negative side, of course, is the industry is dominated by a few small, large players. The plus side is those large players are relatively stable and they're protected by regulation. And again, as former Prime Minister Martin just mentioned, our banking regulations were a little bit tighter. Still not tight enough, frankly. You could still have a crisis of confidence and a collapse if depositors and the interbank lending system froze up. Remember, the banks take every dollar of capital in their reserves and they lend it out 20 or 30 times in Canada. So you can still have a bank run, as we used to call it. But in America, they were lending it out 50 or 75 times. So it was much more precarious there, in part because the industry was more fragmented and more competitive and less regulated. So, to some extent, the fact that we were a separate country, we were determined to have, our own rules and regulations on this system and support and give a bit of protection to Canadian institutions in the financial system, rather than going full hog, the global idea that, we'll just be part of a global system. We actually did try to protect a bit of a Canadian identity in banking. That helped us big time when the crisis hit.
Speaking of nationalism, Angela, I'm curious, did other nations envy Canada and how we handled this situation?
Yes, I remember a few years after the great financial crisis when I was working at the Canadian Labour Congress, and we were still seeing globally a really slow recovery from it. And other countries were recommending to Canada that we increase our public spending, that we increase the amount of investment we made in the economy, because we were in a position to be able to do so, and that investment that Canada was making could help kind of kickstart growth globally. There were countries who were asking, those who could step up and replace some of that gap in business investment that we saw after the financial crisis, that we should do that. And we could, build things that we needed for the long term, and we would have been better off if we had done that. And it also would have helped, kind of get stuff circulating in the global economy potentially. So the OECD, the IMF, other international agencies were asking Canada to do that. Europe was asking us to step up and kind of make those injections into the economy. But the government at the time, it was really a hard sell. So they weren't going as far as we would have liked them to.
All right, Randall, I'm curious. It seems like we were in a better situation, but a lot of that, I'm curious to know if it had to do with what was happening in the 90s. As Minister of Finance in the 1990s, Martin was also known for getting Canada's spending and deficit under control. I'm curious, how did Canada's improved balance sheet contribute to its ability to weather the financial crisis better than the other nations?
Well, I mean, part of it was precisely because, as Jim was saying earlier, it's very highly concentrated, but it's not an oligopoly. And you have to think back to when the two largest banks in Canada were proposing to merge in the late 1990s, and that was ruled out. I mean, Canada has been an interesting model. One of the interesting aspects about coming out of that financial crisis in 2008, 2009, was that the model that Canada projects was, it was examined, it was looked at, and it seemed to have struck a better balance than others. For example, in the United States, but in Britain, in Ireland, in Iceland, in many European countries, a lot of European banks were even more leveraged than American and financial institutions. So there was a balance that was struck, and I mean it's interesting because it plays into a much longer view of Canada punching really above its weight in terms of participating in the international aspect of financial regulation.
All right, let's talk about the banks. One of the remedies to the crisis in advanced economies was lowering of interest rates. Here's a chart showing Canada's rate moves from left to right. You can see they dropped sharply in 2008 to 1% or less and stayed in that range for years. Angela, I'm curious, what were the biggest consequences to the Canadian economy to having such low interest rates for so long?
So one of the things we saw is that households took on increasing amounts of debt. The housing market prices increased dramatically over this period. In other countries, there was a correction in the housing market after the 2008 crisis. In Canada, we didn't see that correction. We saw housing prices continue to increase. We saw the amount of debt that households took on, whether it was auto loans, for mortgages, or for student loans. There was more and more debt, and we saw the debt to income, the average debt to income ratio for households just kind of kept climbing because it was really cheap to take on that debt. And if you were able to, it was a way to make up a gap in other areas. If you had less income, if your household wages kind of weren't keeping pace with the costs of living and what you needed to buy, you added more debt to your household. So by the time COVID hits and we have that spike in inflation and the spike in interest rates, households had a huge amount of debt that they had taken on when interest rates were really low, and faced now huge costs that they were not accustomed to in terms of having to service that debt. So that kind of created a big shock for households.
All right, I want to show another chart. This one, an index of Canadian home prices, and you can see, focusing sort of on the left side of the screen, a sharp increase in values during the time rates were low between 2008 and 2018. Jim, why did the housing market become so important to the Canadian economy over this time?
Well, the housing market has always been important. It's a big part of our spending and a big part of our activity, construction, and so on. What happened was it became overvalued. It didn't necessarily become more important as a share of total GDP or total employment. It's just prices became too expensive. And as Angela was saying, it is the flip side of the coin of low interest rates. We needed those low interest rates at the time of the crisis. But generally, when interest rates fall, home prices rise. For the simple reason that the debt service charges of taking on a mortgage are reduced. So people feel, and they're encouraged by the banks to feel this way, they feel they can take on more debt. And that credit creation bubble drives up the price of housing. So it's an unfortunate side effect of having low interest rates. Now, I think the real problem was not that interest rates were cut during the peak times of the crisis. That was quite appropriate. But that they ended up staying so low through most of the 2010s. Normally, you would have expected a recovery in interest rates back to sort of normal levels. But that didn't happen in Canada and around the world because the general recovery from the global crisis, but especially in Europe, was very, very weak. So central banks were reluctant to increase interest rates after the immediate crisis had passed. So it was that sustained period of low interest rates, mostly reflecting the general weakness of the recovery in some parts of the world, that then allowed housing prices just to rise and rise and rise and rise. And that set the stage, obviously, for the problems of unaffordability in housing that Canadians are experiencing today.
Angela, did you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that government policy at the time kind of exacerbated the crisis. We had a period of time where you were able to put less money down and get a mortgage, and they were able to be extended over a longer period of time, which actually also encouraged households to take on, larger amounts of debt and to not necessarily always be aware of what the consequences would be when 5 years later, interest rates were higher. So we had large amounts of debt over long periods of time without large down payments, which was introduced in order to allow people to get into the housing market when it was so expensive, but it had the consequence of continuing to drive up prices.
One thing I think it shows, the whole experience shows that the reliance on sort of private market decisions to govern our whole housing system can be quite risky. So you've got the banks pushing credit when interest rates are low, and then the government responding to that by saying, well, we better help Canadians try to offset the impacts of the debt load that results from that. And I think this whole decade, really, of housing price bubble revealed the weakness of relying solely on private market for housing, and the fact that in the 90s, unfortunately, under that same finance minister, Paul Martin, Canada got right out of the kind of public or affordable housing area and instead put everything over into private markets.
All right, I want to get Randall on.
Yeah, and a part of that continues. I mean, that's still the focus is on making it easier for new homeowners to buy houses and take on the debt that results. But I would also add to that. I'm not like an economist with only 3 or 4 hands here, but this was a global phenomenon. I mean, house prices around the world, they did correct, most importantly in the United States, but there was a huge run-up in house prices, in Europe and elsewhere. And the part of the problem for the maintenance of low interest rates was, there was a gigantic debt crisis in Europe, a sovereign debt crisis that really took hold 2 or 3 years after the financial crisis, and really, in some respects, hasn't totally been resolved. So this is a kind of a global phenomenon. And you add, and it's not just about the housing. This is the interesting thing. And, that debt levels ballooned after the financial crisis. And then they ballooned again during the pandemic, partly, because of quantitative easing, because it's not just that central banks were lowering interest rates, but they were actually advancing money into the general economy and to their governments in ways that were, in certain respects, unprecedented. And this is absolutely one way to address a financial, an economic challenge. It would be nice if there was not just a monetary response, but also like a fiscal response and certain other things. But really, the choice was made for a variety of political reasons to do with an avoidance of governments on obviously taking on more debt. They would allow it to be done by central banks. But really, debt loads have gone. Now, there's no, I think, this is a very, contentious issue in the economics and the political economy fields of study about what is the maximum debt load one can. I personally think that in the case of the United States government, there is no maximum. But nevertheless, for other countries, and I would include Canada, that they don't have a global reserve currency, they do actually have limits, and so we're kind of dealing with that as well. So we now have a world in which there is an abundance of capital floating around. So we have asset inflation, not just housing inflation. We have financial asset inflation of all kinds, which really I think is a part of the shadow and the overhang of the financial crisis.
All right, Randall, I'm actually going to stick with you because you mentioned the U.S. and I want to talk about sort of the current trade tensions with the U.S. and the push for Canada to diversify its international trading partners. Looking back now, should Canada have used this period to forge stronger trade ties with places like Asia or Europe? I know that those take a while to put together, but was that an opportunity, a missed opportunity?
It's been a missed opportunity for over half a century, right? I mean, there are so many obvious reasons why the vast bulk of the stuff that Canada produces goes to the United States. It's obvious. But yes, there's a vulnerability there. And that vulnerability, we also, you go back to the early 2000s. I mean, Canada's recovery from, in the 1990s and early 2000s especially, the recovery from a very severe I would say recession at the beginning of that period was really on the back of a less expensive dollar and huge amount of exports, including we had an auto industry, a much more robust auto industry, and oil over that period. So for Canada, yes, it's a vulnerability, but in a world of growing trade, there are ways you can justify that trade-off. But one of the biggest I think after effects of the financial crisis has been a slowing of globalization. Okay, so international trade levels are actually not nearly, they haven't risen like they would have. So in fact, international trade, there is less of it. And in that kind of world, Canada, has to fight even harder. And it's much more sharp now.
I want to get Angela's take on that as well in terms of a missed opportunity when we talk about other key trading partners.
Sure. So we did try to negotiate trade agreements with Europe. We did negotiate the Canadian-European Economic Trade Agreement, CETA, which finally I think was signed in 2017, but it takes a long time, especially when there are multiple partners that you're negotiating with. We also negotiated the Trans-Pacific Partnership that the United States ended up pulling out of with a whole bunch of partners. Now, I would argue that international trade deals that what we did was the wrong approach, because an international trade deal is really setting global rules for trade. It's setting this kind of like international consensus, which doesn't necessarily help us increase trade. What matters to increase trade relationships is relationships, is knowing what types of things Europe might want to buy from Canada. What could we produce for them? We know and understand the United States market very well, right? They're very similar to us. They're very close to us. And so it absolutely makes sense that businesses would be kind of targeting that market and trying to reach that market, and that it takes a much longer path to be able to target a market that is geographically farther away, that is culturally more different from us. And so there needs to be a lot of work helping to build those relationships and to think strategically about what industries we might support, what linkages we might build between industries that would be advantageous for us and strategic for us to trade on the international market with.
Jim, I'm curious, one of the things that we touched on just briefly was about innovation. And I want to get your take on sort of innovation in the tech industry. What's the connection between the rise of the financial innovation in the US, say Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, and the financial crisis?
Well, Bitcoin came after the GFC, but certainly the general process of financial innovation, and I should put scare quotes around innovation there, because it isn't really the kind of innovation we want. These are people sitting in desks in financial centers figuring out new ways to make money, buying one piece of paper and selling it 2 seconds later for a fraction higher. But if you do that often enough, you can make a killing. So that's the kind of financial innovation that created the groundwork for the financial crisis. What we really need in the economy is real innovation, investment in capital and technology and skills and new industry, so that we can produce value-added stuff for those world markets. That's another thing that's held back our trade performance, not just since the GFC, but over a longer period of time as well. The fact that Canada is underdeveloped in terms of those high-value, technology-intensive industries. One aftershock from the global financial crisis that we shouldn't forget was the huge impact on the auto industry in Canada. It is one of the only sectors where Canada has punched above its weight in terms of value-added manufacturing, obviously very export-oriented, very dependent on the U.S. economy. Remember, during the worst days of the crisis, you had two of the three major North American automakers, so General Motors and at the time Chrysler, have to file for bankruptcy protection and restructuring. And so we had a big drama on both sides of the border where the U.S. government and the Canadians, both the federal government and the Ontario government, really came to the table with some very important and massive supports to help GM and Chrysler through. Eventually, Ford got some of the savings and other restructuring, even though they didn't go through bankruptcy protection. So that was a very dramatic moment where, you know, the future of Canadian manufacturing really was at stake. And luckily, interesting, even though we had a conservative federal government at the time, and then a liberal government in Ontario, they kind of put aside the politics, if you like. And there was, you know, Prime Minister Stephen Harper at the time, what a surprise, putting tens of billions of dollars of money into help keep the auto industry going. And it was very important. So we still have an auto industry today because of those actions. But it was a very, very painful and risky moment.
All right, we've got 1 minute left, and we've got one question that I'm hoping I can split between Angela and Randall here. Randall, you get the first try at it. Prime Minister Carney was once Bank of Canada governor. How did his leadership through that crisis help prepare him to run the country now?
Yeah, that's an intriguing question. I mean, I would say that so when you're the Bank of Canada, you're heading the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, it's not simply an economic position or a technocratic position. He's got to negotiate. But he negotiates, you know, from a very interesting position. It's a position of judicial and statutory independence. He has a lot of resources at his beck and call. And, you know, some might say that even though he's negotiating with others, and trying to convince them to go in the particular financially prudent way that is the central banker's default mode of acting. It's not really, I think, it's not really a background that prepares you for the cut and thrust of modern democratic politics. And in point of fact, I cannot myself, and I should have done this research before today, I cannot remember or recall a successful central banker becoming a successful political leader, later on in their career, because it's, you're dealing with a different set of cut and thrust. But having said that, the man has the kind of knowledge, skills that I think are purpose-built for this, today's moment. And I, like everyone else, I wish him well. But I do think he's going to have to, the learning curve is relatively steep.
All right, Angela, you got 15 seconds.
Sorry, Angela.
No worries.
Okay, I think maybe I can summarize that and put that in maybe a bit more blunt language. He's very technocratic. He's very intelligent. He understands how the system works very well. But I think his impulse is going to want to do things very quickly. We've seen this with the two bills he's put before Parliament that he's trying to push through before it having any kind of parliamentary committee oversight. And that just isn't how democracies work. I don't think that's how we come up with resilient solutions and approaches. I think the best answer is not always the technocratic answer. The best answer that works in a democracy actually is something that's sorted out through difficult conversations and through negotiating kind of compromises between different points of view. Whereas he's the smartest guy in the room and is usually able to convince those to negotiate in a way to convince those that his approach is best. That's not the way democracies work. And so that I agree the learning curve might be quite high.
All right, we are going to leave it there. Angela, Jim, Randall, thank you so much for joining us in studio, and thank you for your insights. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
The world may be changing rapidly, but one thing is not. Its demand for natural resources, many of which Canada has supplied for generations. The new Mark Carney government and an increasing number of Canadians seem to be embracing this country's desire to provide these raw materials. But how can our nation boost development while also balancing modern considerations such as First Nations consultation and climate change? Let's find out. In Calgary, Alberta, Heather Exner-Perot, Senior Fellow and Director of Energy, Natural Resources and the Environment at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. In New York City, Ellen Cherney, chief news editor at the Wall Street Journal and former managing editor at the Globe and Mail. And here in our studio, for his 8th appearance on our program, Stan Sudol, editor of the Republic of Mining. Stan, welcome back to you and
Thank
to
you.
our friends in Points Beyond. We're glad you spared some time for us on TVO tonight. Elena, let me put you to work right away. What is the historic connection, just a little background, between natural resources extraction and our prosperity here in Canada over the years?
Well, I mean, we could write a treatise on that. Canada has been historically very dependent, obviously, on natural resources since the very earliest days of the fur trade, and we could, talk about that and the history there. I think what's salient, though, here is that in recent decades, Canada has remained and indeed in some ways become increasingly dependent on fossil fuel extraction since the oil sands boom in the early aughts. And that really has led to the current debate over how to get some of this stuff to market effectively and sort of hand-wringing over why we haven't done a better job of that and have remained so dependent on those natural resources.
Stan, could we be the country we are today without these resources?
Absolutely not. Between oil and gas on the West Coast, between the mining booms in Northern Ontario, nickel, copper, cobalt in the Sudbury Basin, copper in Rouyn-Noranda, it's absolutely integral to the prosperity of the country.
Let's see if people agree with you. We've got some numbers that we want to share here. So let us take a look at the change in sentiment among Canadians for natural resource products, specifically oil and gas pipelines. We're going to do some comparison. February 2025, Angus Reid polling, gauging support for the Energy East oil pipeline from Alberta to Atlantic Canada. And we'll compare that to the same question asked in 2019, so 6 years ago. And for those listening on podcast, we got a bunch of bar graphs here, and I'm just going to read I'm going to read across from left to right and let you know what's going on. So support for this project 6 years ago was 58% across the country. Today, 65%. Up. Let's go province by province. British Columbia, up 11 points. I'm going to skip the next one. Saskatchewan, the same. Manitoba, up 9 points. Ontario, up 7 points. Quebec, even Quebec, up 14 points. And in Atlantic Canada, up 6 points. The one outlier here, interestingly enough, is Alberta, where support has dropped, apparently, 12 points. Now, Heather, that's where I got to get you in here and say, how is it possible in every other part of the country support is up, but in Alberta, the heart of oil and gas country, it's down? Make sense of that for us.
That's fascinating. I hadn't seen the breakdown by province. I had to point out Alberta was still the highest, but the reason is because Albertans are extremely energy literate and follow the oil and gas sector very closely. And what happened is that the business dynamics of Energy East have changed dramatically. It used to be about filling a very large section of pipe that was being underutilized that has now been filled with natural gas. And so the business case for Energy East is very different.
Could this pipeline, Heather, in your view, be built today?
I mean, technically it could be built. Again, you're taking Alberta oil across the Canadian Shield. And that is a very difficult proposition. And at the time, like I say, to fill some underutilized pipe, it might have made sense. But if, from an Alberta perspective, if your goal is just to maximize production and maximize profits, which creates royalties and revenues and taxes and jobs for everybody, then you are looking to go west towards the Asian market.
Stan, obviously in the previous Trudeau government, there was a strongly held sense in Western Canada that the federal government was not interested in building more pipelines. They dubbed one of the bills that came out of Parliament the No More Pipelines Act. What, in your view, does Prime Minister Carney have to do legislatively to prove to companies that the government is serious about allowing these new pieces of infrastructure to be built?
He has to sort of temper down or eliminate that bill that riled basically the people in the Ring of Fire as well as Western Canadians. And the one thing with resource development is, yes, we need to not peel back, but at least limit some of the environmental regulations or the time it takes to either build a road or a pipeline. But at the same time, because it's crossing First Nations territories, you really do need to look at some sort of Marshall Plan for soft infrastructure in a lot of these communities, centered on healthcare, education, housing supply. The problem with, they want First Nations want to be consulted, and I was talking to Saul
Mamakwa, yes, yeah.
A few weeks ago.
Queen's Park MPP.
Yes, for our, the penny dropped. He basically said, it's not like the consultation is basically, part of the consultation process is basically, what are you going to do to invest in our communities so we are job ready and are able to take advantage of the business opportunities and the jobs that are there. And that part I'm not seeing done yet.
I'm going to come back to that in a second. Ellen, how well do you know Mark Carney?
Good question. I've interviewed him and met him over the years as Bank of Canada governor, and also during his time representing the UN, or doing climate work for the UN. So have had the chance to hear him talk at some length about his climate finance initiatives and his leadership on that front.
Well,
which
you've
I think
anticipated.
is very interesting.
Yeah, you've anticipated where I want to go next, which is, of course, as Governor of the Bank of England, as Governor of the Bank of Canada, from his time at Brookfield, from his time associated with the United Nations, he has been pretty clear that the world has to do business differently in order to protect the environment and stave off the consequences of climate change. And yet, in his very short time as Prime Minister already, he's giving a lot of signals that he is open to much more significant oil and gas exploitation and related infrastructure projects. How is he balancing these two seemingly conflicting approaches?
Well, that's the big question. Is this Canada's moment to develop a model that other countries can to sort of balance climate concerns and energy development, conventional energy development, in a way that becomes a model for the rest of the world? Is this something that is doable? Or is this goal of becoming an energy superpower while also meeting, Paris commitments, for example, magic thinking? Is there such a thing as decarbonized barrels of oil? I think those are some specifics that Canadians are going to want to hear spelled out, and the ability of this government to pull off this delicate balancing act, I think, will be watched very closely around the world.
Heather, you're watching. What are you coming up with?
Well, it's kind of, the worst part of the last 10 years is that we've made this into an either-or conversation. And you need energy to survive and to thrive, and our civilization depends on fossil fuels. And yet, you also want to mitigate the environmental consequences. What I think people always miss is how good Canada is at doing that, at finding the balance. And so in almost any commodity you can think of, Canada usually performs in the top decile or the top quartile of GHG intensity. And part of it is our clean grid with lots of hydro, part of it is the high quality of our reserves, and part of it is our high standards. And even on fossil fuels, our LNG is the cleanest in the world. Our conventional oil is far below the global average for GHG intensity. And even with our heavy barrels, yes, our bitumen from the oil sands has a lower GHG intensity than comparable heavy barrels. And if we did something like the Pathways Alliance, you would even see that get below the global average of all crudes.
I guess I'm wondering, though, given his background, do you believe the signals coming out of Ottawa today, that he's serious about trying to get more oil and gas related infrastructure built?
Listen, there's cautious optimism out here for the first time in a decade, so we do want to give him the benefit of the doubt. He is saying the right things, and Hodgson is saying the right things. And more than that, being more open to conversations and hearing from industry than we've had in a very long time. So, of course, there'll be a honeymoon period, and then at some point, the rubber will hit the road, and we'll have to see some action. But certainly people out here are willing to give him the benefit of the doubt on the path they're on right now.
The Hodgson you referred to as Tim Hodgson, the new Natural Resources Minister. So indeed, and they know each other well. So yes, we are going to watch this team. Stan, what are you thinking as you compare his very pro-environment past to his seemingly very pro-infrastructure present?
I think there's a reality check, waking up and smelling the coffee. The economy is not doing well. There's a fellow called President Trump who is basically
we've heard of him,
who is basically threatening the economic viability of our manufacturing sector, as well as some of our resource sector. So we need to look at new markets for our oil and gas. As Heather may have mentioned, the amount of tax revenue coming in from both our oil and gas sectors, it's the largest part of the Canadian economy. Number two, by a little bit of a second place, is Ontario's manufacturing economy. So we really do need resources to keep our standard of living high and to deal with whatever else President Trump is going to be throwing at us.
Let me check with Ellen and see whether she agrees with that. What's the sort of word on the street? What is, as you look at the metrics, what is your sense about whether or not the demand for oil and gas related products in the future will be as strong as it has been in the past?
Well, I think projections are sort of a little bit in flux on that, and some of that will depend on things like the pace of EV adoption, for example, in the United States, which has flagged in recent years, and if subsidies go away, that will have an impact. So it's hard to sort of, I think, be precise, and you get all kinds of different ranges of estimates from different players on when demand for fossil fuel products will actually peak. But I think it's pretty clear, as Heather said, as both Heather and Stan have said, that the world is going to remain dependent on these products for some time to come, and Canada has these products to sell. The question is, can it be done in a way that balances the climate concerns and emissions concerns with the desire to get these products to market in a way that is economically beneficial to Canadians?
Well, Heather, I guess the other question is, and I'm hearing a lot of people advancing this idea, do we really want to be spending or encouraging private companies to spend billions upon billions of dollars on more infrastructure to move a product which the world is very much trying to, maybe not successfully, but trying to wean itself off of over the next 20 years? What do you think?
Well, there's this argument of stranded assets, and the first one is to say that you'd much rather have a stranded asset than an energy crisis. An energy crisis is so painful and so horrible for the 8 billion people on this planet, and we saw that just 3 years ago. But do I think there'll be stranded assets? I don't. And even as we try to get off supply, one is population is still growing, and population is actually moving in large parts of the world from a low class to a middle class. And by definition, that means that they'll consume more energy. And so we do project more growth. The OPEC Secretary General yesterday projected it to 120 million barrels in the coming years. Whether we are at 80 million or 120 million barrels in 2050, it is very important that there is a democracy, a NATO ally, that's providing a significant portion of that. And we know that American reserves and production is probably peaking. EIA just called it. They're calling 2025 as peak oil production. We also know that Norwegian oil and gas production is probably peaking this year. And so whatever is the mix, you better make sure that Canada is providing a significant amount of it going forward.
It is interesting that talk of climate change has almost disappeared as people fret, not without reason, about the state of the economy today. And we talked to Mark Carney on this program 4 years ago about what he thought about climate change and what he intended to do about it. And here's what he had to say. Sheldon, roll it if you would.
It is one of the biggest risks to the Canadian economy, and it's arguably the biggest opportunity for the Canadian economy. I mean, after all, as Prime Minister Harper used to say, rightly so, that Canada is an energy superpower. The energies of the future can build on Canadian strengths, including in carbon capture storage, hydrogen, in hydro, direct air capture, and beyond. But we need to consciously pursue those while we manage our existing resources.
Mr. Carney's really tried to make the point that this is not an either-or situation, it's a both-and. We can both tend to the environmental concerns we have while at the same time exploiting the natural resources that we do have. Is that really possible?
Absolutely. And just one point with the oil and gas story. Yes, it's largely used for heating and transportation, but a significant part of that sector is being processed into fertilizer and a whole slew of other products.
Hundreds of products.
We're not going to totally get rid of oil and gas, even if everybody was driving an electric vehicle, because there are some materials our modern society needs that are absolutely dependent on oil and gas. So yes, I think we can do both. We can be a very clean, sustainable oil and gas producer, but at the same time, as we electrify, we're going to need the nickel, the copper, the uranium in northern Saskatchewan, all the other products that go into the batteries and the charging stations. And also we have to remember that much of the electricity grid in the U.S. was built in the 1950s during that boom. That all needs to be changed. That's the amount of copper that you need for that is just extraordinary. So we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can do both.
Well, I wonder, Elena, is this a both and or an either or?
I think it depends on the specifics that we have not seen yet. And you know, in looking at this, I read in one place, one commentator said that, you know, decarbonized oil is as absurd as talking about vitamin cigarettes or weight loss ice cream. Now, that's one perspective. But I think from what I understand, the Carney super energy superpower vision and the ability of Canada to sort of walk and chew gum, it depends in part also on developing new technologies, new carbon capture technologies. It depends on the Pathways Alliance, which I think Heather mentioned earlier. There's still a lot of questions about that technology and the ability to pull it off at a commercial scale. So I think we need to know a little bit more and about the costing, about what these technologies can accomplish, and about really the government's plans to invest in them.
Heather, I know they're talking in Northern Ontario about zero emission mining, and they think they're close. And that comes as a shock to anybody who has an image in their mind of, you know, guys on their knees going 5,000 feet below the Earth's surface and drilling for whatever. Is it possible to imagine an oil and gas sector that actually exploits those resources in a way that doesn't harm the environment?
You know, with 8 billion humans, there's going to be an impact on the environment. I think this is a luxury question to think, can we do this, you know, with impacts on the environment or without impacts on the environment? No, you cannot have 8 billion people. You cannot support modern civilization without some resource extraction. And so the question is, how do we do it the best? And I think the policy the last 10 years has been about making our sector smaller. And the beneficiaries of that has been countries like China and Russia, who's been able to adopt more market share. The question should be, and the trade-off is, will we be developing it in the ways that we know are best-in-class global leading standards, or will we lead it to other countries to develop it in ways that we know are not? And so, yes, there's so much happening in technology and innovation. There's a huge clean tech sector in Alberta and Western Canada and BC, and they're looking for the market opportunities, and they're trying to reduce those emissions and trying to decarbonize the barrel, which to me is just lowering the GHG intensity of that barrel. And so, yes, there are innovations where you're using electric vehicles in underground mining. If you have access to hydropower to do that, fantastic. If you don't, then we're thinking about using SMRs for that in the future. We're even thinking about using SMRs in the oil sands. Again, because a large part of that GHG intensity is the natural gas used to heat the bitumen so it'll flow. So everyone is on board with this, and we don't think it's a zero-sum game. We don't think reducing emissions is going to harm the sector. We think it's going to create that sustainable lifespan for it.
Just so I'm clear, SMRs, small modular reactors, these are the new nukes that are coming forward?
Your Ontario audience would know all about that, Steve.
I'm sure they do. Just checking. I want to circle back to what Stan raised earlier, which is the notion of First Nations participation and or consultation in all of this. And we did a program here not too long ago because, of course, the province of Ontario just passed something called Bill 5, which has angered some in the First Nations communities, not all, but some. Because it purports to give the government new powers to exploit natural resources in ways that perhaps were not there before. Here is Moose Cree First Nation Chief Peter Wesley and his reaction to that change. Sheldon, if you would.
Prior to Bill 5 coming out, we've reached out to Premier Ford and Minister Rickford to engage with us because we're like that, like it's been stated here, we're not against development. We just want you to work with us in how we want things to be developed within our homeland. And we never received a response.
How would you rate the level of trust between the current government of Ontario and the First Nations who are rightly concerned about their need to be consulted on this, as the Supreme Court has laid out?
Very, very low. I'm a keen proponent for mining and Aboriginal consultation. I've been on this program. I've this government seemed to have been doing the right thing. I think now they've done a couple of steps backwards because of this sledgehammer approach. I think instead of trying to bulldoze their way, pardon the pun,
and that's what the Premier said. He said he'd get on a bulldozer himself and build a road in northwestern Ontario if he had to.
You could have done this a lot better in the sense of bring your checkbooks with you, both federal and provincial, with more investment in these communities. You have a power line called the Wate Power Line, which connects 24 isolated first communities. You already have an industrial corridor snaking through northwestern Ontario. Why not start building a gravel road beside the power line? There's a section between Red Lake and Sandy Lake.
This is northwestern Ontario?
Yeah. And basically, you have 10,000 isolated communities. They want the road. They've had problems with wildfires this past few weeks. Deer Lake, which has the biggest lithium mine next to it, they took them 4 days to evacuate the community, and they were worried the fire was going to take out the airport. If there's not a critical need for the roads before, because winter haulage roads are very short because of global warming, that you almost lost your airport to a fire gives you added impetus to say, build these roads and build them now.
Elena, how does trust get restored?
I think that's a very complex question, and it's going to depend on the province and the jurisdiction and whether you're talking about First Nations communities. But I think details seem to be lacking in all of these questions. Stan talked about the need for a Marshall Plan. If you want communities to buy in and you want them to, whether it's a Quebec community or a First Nations community, I think it's got to be clear to them what's in it for them and what the stakes are, and not just sort of in an abstract what this means for Canada kind of a way, but what does this actually mean for me and my family? Where are the jobs? And what will happen if we don't do this? And those details just don't, we're in this honeymoon period, but those details, it would seem, need to be forthcoming for there to be actual movement here.
And Heather, let me ask you the flip side of this, which is it possible that some governments and some companies are going to have to just simply accept the fact that in some Indigenous communities, they are not going to be interested in exploiting these resources or participating in them?
So, I mean, we've been getting much better at this out west in particular, but across Canada for the last 20 years since the duty to consult was affirmed in the Supreme Court of Canada. And when I hear about the Ring of Fire, that's often the worst case scenario. There's lots of mining projects and lots of oil and gas projects and lots of pipeline projects and lots of transmission projects where there actually is a pretty good relationship and where the benefits are pretty clear. And as the chief that you had, speaks to that, they're not against development, they're against being left out. And we have some tools in the toolbox now to make sure that they are included and they do benefit. I used to talk about procurement, about employment, and now recently about equity. And you're seeing more and more projects where Indigenous communities are equity owners. But the law is clear. There's a duty to consult and accommodate based on impacts on rights. And it's not a veto. It isn't in Canadian law to be able to say no. What the circumstance is that you have to accommodate the impacts on those rights. And on the other side, though, for Indigenous communities, there is also a reciprocal duty to articulate what are those impacts on rights? What are some solutions that you could mitigate them? And so there's an expectation of reasonableness on both sides. Both sides, plus the government, have to come in with solutions. And it's not enough to just be in principle opposed to a project. The opposition has to be based on the impacts on rights, and you have to be reasonable in trying to find ways to mitigate those impacts.
Stan, I should ask you, because I got a note from somebody the other day who watches this stuff in Northern Ontario, and he said to me, you can't paint the entire Indigenous community with the same brush, in as much as some are in favor of resource extraction and being partners and being a part of all of that, but others are opposed. But if you look at where the resources are, you won't find opposition. You will find opposition elsewhere. Is that your understanding of things?
It's partly true. In regards to the chief from Moose Cree, what people aren't aware of is they have an incredible impact benefit agreement with Agnico Eagle's Detour Gold open pit. 20% of the workforce is Indigenous. They're getting tens of millions of dollars of royalty payments from that massive gold mine, hundreds of millions of dollars on a yearly basis with indigenous business contracts with Detour Gold Mine. So that's the gold plate standard. Yeah. Even on the other side in Saul's home community of Kingfisher, it's very close to the Musselwhite underground gold mine. And there's impact benefit. It's one of the oldest mines. Built in the early mid-90s, and they have impact benefit agreements with Kingfisher First Nation, North Caribou Lake First Nation. Percentage of the workforce is indigenous. There's indigenous business contracts. So, you know, where their mining is there, and this was in the mid-90s, the companies are really digging deep, pardon the pun, of training Aboriginals and having business opportunities.
We got to be careful just not to sort of lump everybody into the same category here.
Yeah.
Okay. I got about a minute left here. Heather, I want to ask you, since you're in Calgary right now, I gather there's about 30,000 oil and gas decision makers from around the world currently in that city for the Global Energy Show Canada. You're going to it. What do we need to know?
Well, I mean, the big news was, of course, OPEC Secretary General yesterday. But I guess, you know, there is optimism in the Canadian sector. Again, we're starting to look pretty good to other options, our global peers, whereas for the last 10 years, we've looked pretty bad. But starting to look like Canadian oil and gas is where you want your investment to be. We have just an incredible long reserve life, low decline rates, you know, over a century's worth of production on both the oil and gas side. And so, you know, when you're going into turbulence, and we've shown at these low prices that we have today between $60, $65 WTI, that actually the Canadian barrel is quite resilient at that level. So we're looking for brighter times ahead. And for once, you know, it seems like we might have a partner in the federal government.
WTI, West Texas International?
Thank you, Steve.
We like to be an acronym-free zone here, but anyway, I get it. Elena, last 20 seconds. What's it like for a Canadian to live in Trump's America right now?
Fascinating times. Great time to be a journalist in the United States. Never a dull moment. And I think it's really important to continue chronicling and reporting on events as they unfold, hopefully in a dispassionate and impartial and calm way so that we really get the facts.
There's not a lot of that going on, Elena, so we rely on you to make sure that happens. Let me thank Heather Exner-Perot, Macdonald-Laurier Institute in Calgary, Elena Cherney, Wall Street Journal in New York City, and Stan Sudol, Republic of Mining, here in our studio. Great to have all of you with us on TVO tonight. Many thanks.
Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Thursday, June the 12th, 2025. Tomorrow on the program, John Michael McGrath and yours truly on the end of the legislative session at Queen's Park in a new episode of On Poly. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.